AB 30. There we go.
Will you click out of that, please?
Okay. Some other legislation, AB 32, which is Global Warming Solutions Act, identified the need to for reducing greenhouse gas emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. AB or SB 375, which identified requirements for regional transportation planning agencies to develop what's called sustainable community strategies that would identify measures in the transportation system and land use context to reduce those emissions to that level to achieve the AB 32 requirements. And then most recently, SB 743, which changed CEQA. So it's a change to CEQA, not necessarily general plan law, but the requirement is eliminating level of service for transportation analysis in CEQA and replacing that with vehicle miles of traveled. Again, it's all building on AB 32 and looking at implementation, but for the context of Rio Vista General Plan, the need to do the analysis and evaluate vehicle miles of traveled, and that's the basis of the transportation impact analysis, one of the elements. It also presents some opportunities for the city for CEQA streamlining that we'll discuss a little bit more as we move on.
Dave, are you going to explain more about SB 375 and VMT and LOS later?
Yes.
Okay, great. It's fairly technical. We're going to want to make sure the group understands.
Yeah, and a good point, Paul. If I use some jargon, transportation industry is filled with jargon. If I use a term like VMT and don't explain what that is, just call me out, ask me, and I'll explain that. So vehicle miles of travel, VMT is that acronym. Some other policy that is more recent relates to, it's really driven out of the issues that we've had as a state and in the Western country with wildfires and evacuation under those circumstances and scenarios. But there's two, SB 99 and AB 747, which relate to evacuation analysis and evacuation routes. There's work that the transportation analysis will support the safety element update. So it's tangentially related, but you'll find that there's a lot of areas that the circulation element update, a lot of the output from that is going to support other resource areas. So for the circulation element, there's 4 key areas, and that's the circulation element support. So a lot of this, the work we're doing is going to support the development of the document, the policy development, policy refinement, and really establishing the goals and the values and making sure that we're communicating the values and the goals of the city in that document. There's 3 major analysis components, and that's a citywide transportation analysis, and that's a more holistic approach that we'll talk about. There's the VMT for CEQA analysis. Again, we'll discuss that and what that means relative to the city and the opportunities for streamlined environmental review, which is really important. And then focusing in a more concentrated effort, just a more detailed look at Highway 12 analysis. So those are the three components. I'm going to go through those in a little bit more detail, and then we'll have some opportunities to discuss that. So the circulation element support, it really comes out of trying to identify through these kind of conversations and input community values and needs. And we're going to inform that through the three technical efforts that we'll talk a little bit more below, and help frame key issues, translate key findings into new policy and implementation processes. Establish a transportation system. So that's identifying the number of lanes on the roadways, any new potential roadways, any new bicycle pedestrian facilities. So the active transportation modes. What kind of policy and actions do we want to include in the general plan that will help future councils and planning commissions and residents, you know, if we're looking out 20 years, 10 to 20 years, help communicate those ideas and use this document as a way to implement that vision that we have today out into the future. So to make sure that we're actually implementing what the city wants. And then we'll support with the documentation. So that's that element, the circulation element support component. It's going to be pulling all the technical analysis together and supporting Paul and the rest of the general plan team in the development of the general plan and the circulation element. And I mentioned that the transportation analysis it supports a lot of other technical studies, including greenhouse gas analysis, air quality analysis, noise analysis, and the safety element. So the output from the work we're going to do is going to help and support those other sets of analysis and resources. So the citywide transportation analysis, again, it's holistic. So we're looking at the whole city. We're addressing the issues that the statutory requirements of the complete streets. So we're looking at all modes, active transportation modes, and it's going to be supported by a fairly significant and robust data collection effort. So back in 2001, from a transportation perspective, most of that data collection revolved around collecting traffic counts, understanding how much volume was on a roadway or the city's roadway system. We're gonna take a deeper dive in that, and I think it's really important in the conversations that we're having with Paul when we were preparing the scope is really understanding who's traveling in Rio Vista. And I have some examples that I'll share, but who's traveling through the community? How do the people in Rio Vista travel? And then where the residents travel to. So if you think of in terms of work or for recreation, where are residents traveling to? And who's passing through and where are they coming from? So those are some pretty detailed questions that you can't get with just collecting traffic counts on an individual roadway segment. But you can, there's other data available that we can use to try and help answer some of those questions, because the better data that we are able to pull into this effort, the better we're going to be able to kind of address the questions and issues that Rio Vista is facing. Safety. So in addition, we'll collect recent safety data. There's been an effort that we'll talk about too when we talk about recent transportation planning efforts, but there's additional data that we can collect for that as well. Forecasting. So that citywide transportation analysis is going to feed into developing travel forecasts. So forecasting out into the future, how much travel is going to be occurring in the city. And again, it's the integration of the transportation system with the land use. So we're going to bring in the land use growth assumptions for the city, where development's going to happen, where growth is going to occur. And then we're going to look at that and understand that in the context of the future of the city when we look out to 2045.
It's just a bunch of fucking talk.
I have a question. In this, you say cars and trucks. Is the airport separate, or would that be included in this?
That would be included as well. I'm sorry. Yes, thanks for bringing that up. But the airport is definitely one of the requirements that we need to include in the general plan, and it will be incorporated into the document as well. Thank you. And here's some examples of that data. So there's a lot of new data sources. Technology can be good. It can also be challenging at times, but this is one area where some of the technology that we have is very useful from a transportation perspective and understanding who's using the transportation system. So in this case, this is a data vendor called Streetlight. They use mobile source data, so the apps on phones, the smartphones. There are, when you say agree to the terms and conditions, there's anonymous data that's provided to these vendors. And we're able to use that data to understand at a very robust level how travel is occurring in a community. And we had applied this. It's a little bit difficult to see, but we use this type of data to understand travel behavior in Yuba County. So understanding who's traveling in the county, where they're traveling to, who's traveling through the community, and also understanding the purpose of those travels at a fairly high level. How much of that travel is by work or for non-work reasons. Just a very robust data set, and it's something that we'll be able to apply here in Rio Vista to help us understand those travel patterns that will also help us do a better job at forecasting the vehicle miles of travel for residents in the city. And this is just another example. This is on the upper right. It's Streetlight data. It's looking at the origin and destination of trips. In this case, it was trips using the Dublin 580 grade between Dublin and the East Bay, and understanding the origin of those users and then where they were going. So I think it's something definitely what we're considering and want to use is to understand who's using Highway 12, where they're coming from, where they're going to, so that we can better understand what potential opportunities there are to address that. But it's data that was very difficult to come by 15 years ago. It was very expensive. It was used what was called a license plate survey, and it had limited utility, and the confidence in the data was not what you can get today with this fairly reasonably priced purchase of data. It's pretty powerful. Then the CEQA analysis. So vehicle miles of travel. So SB 743, I mentioned, changed CEQA law as it relates to the analysis of and impact analysis for transportation. So you may be familiar with the term level of service. Level of service measured the impact to drivers. So if a driver was delayed at a certain level, then there could be a potentially impact associated with the transportation system because of the impact of the drivers, where VMT with SB 743 is focusing the impact of away from the drivers, but the impact of driving on the environment. So in terms of more vehicle miles traveled, more emissions, more use of transportation systems, and even increased safety risk because you just have more travel is just a pretty significant shift in terms of CEQA analysis. But vehicle miles of traveled, California Environmental Quality Act. So the general plan, we will prepare the circulation element in the general plan, and then there's an environmental document since it needs to be adopted and approved by the city that triggers the environmental quality, California Environmental Quality Act, CEQA. So in the context of transportation, we need to analyze VMT to identify the impact of the project. So vehicle miles traveled, it's the recommended guidance is to use an efficiency metric. So it's vehicle miles of traveled per capita, so per person in the city of Rio Vista. So understanding the performance of the transportation system relative to regional VMT per capita. So is there any question with that, that terminology? It's a lot. Sure.
The vehicle miles traveled does not necessarily define how much time you're spending in your vehicle because it's measuring the miles traveled. And if I was sitting in, let's say on Highway 12 between Trilogy and the bridge for an hour, waiting for the bridge to go up or down, the vehicle miles traveled is only measuring the fact that I was sitting in 3-mile long traffic jam. And it doesn't have anything to do with how much time I'm in my vehicle or even how much pollution I'm doing because the vehicle's sitting there running and not moving anymore.
Yeah. We'll talk about the Highway 12 analysis as well, because while this is specific to CEQA, but it doesn't, the type of analysis and the issues that you're bringing up, the delay associated with, driving on Highway 12 when the bridge is up and people are just sitting there. We're still going to do that analysis, and that'll still be part of the general plan and inform the general plan. It just won't be carried forward in terms of CEQA for transportation, but other aspects, other resource areas like air quality and the greenhouse gas emissions, greenhouse gas analysis will capture that quantitative effect of the delay associated with that impact on Highway 12.
Thank you.
Yeah. So part of our analysis, we're going to have to evaluate data and tools. So what data and tools are available to help do our VMT analysis? The VMT analysis and those tools we'll talk a little bit about. We'll talk about regional travel forecasting models. Sounds pretty onerous, but we'll talk a little bit more about that. But we'll use those tools in data. It could be survey data. It could be some of the streetlight data that we talked about that'll tell us a bit about the behavior of residents today in Rio Vista, where they travel to and their vehicle miles, their VMT footprint. We'll also identify VMT policy and thresholds, as well as potential mitigation measures. In that analysis, we talked about the CEQA section 15183, and that allows for streamlined environmental review for the projects that are consistent with the general plan. So this is a great opportunity for the city of Rio Vista in the context of SB 743 and this change to CEQA and transportation impact analysis. A lot of communities are struggling that have not gone through a general plan update, haven't adopted thresholds for VMT, and haven't conducted that analysis in the context of the general plan. They're limited and not able to take advantage of that streamlined environmental review. And what that means is if we go through and we do our CEQA analysis, regardless of the finding, whether it's significant and there's an statement of overriding consideration required, or whether it's less than significant, the fact that we go through that review and we're in a situation where a future development project comes along that's consistent with the general plan, and we're able to make that finding, then 15183, that CEQA section, says that you don't need to do unnecessary analysis if it's been covered already. So it just provides some fairly significant streamlining benefits for the city in going through this process. So for the CEQA analysis, we do have options. There's the travel demand model, household travel survey data, and mobile source data to support the VMT analysis. But it's not only supporting the VMT analysis, because VMT is an input into the air quality analysis. The greenhouse gas analysis is also can support the safety analysis. But what's shown up here on the right is it's a screenshot of the STA, Travel Demand Forecasting, Solano Transportation Authority, of their regional travel demand forecasting model. So a regional travel demand forecasting model is used to forecast travel in terms of volumes on roadways or the vehicle miles of travel for the entire region or for a component of of the model area. And part of our evaluation of these tools, and it's one of the next steps that we'll talk about, is just making sure that the tool is appropriate for the type of analysis and understanding how the model functions relative to the city of Rio Vista. What's circled up there is the city of Rio Vista in the context of the regional model. So it's no surprise, it's a small area in a very, very large model area. So that's a challenge in the sense of it's kind of the tail wagging the dog when we're looking at a very regional model that sits on the edge of the model area. From a modeling perspective and how we apply this model, it really is, it's an important consideration that we make, and we understand how the model functions to make sure that it's appropriate, and we make any adjustments we need to the model to do, to provide the substantial evidence we need in terms of CEQA, that the analysis that we're doing is accurate and can be replicated and is representative of conditions. But just knowing that and understanding that is really important in making sure that we're addressing those issues. One benefit is when we zoom in on the left there, that those lines and numbers are the actual what's called the traffic analysis zone. So those are the areas that are represented in the model, and those areas for Rio Vista is quite detailed, which is a really good situation for as small as Rio Vista seems in the context of that large model. That's a fair amount of detail, which is good. And travel forecasting models in general simplify that tool. Is there's inputs in terms of the transportation network, which is shown up there on the right. There's the traffic analysis zones. Those traffic analysis zones are geography, so they're representative of areas, in this case within Rio Vista. And within those areas, we include inputs, land use inputs. So it could be residential or non-residential uses. So residential where people live, non-residential being the job centers within the community. And those are inputs into that model, as well as travel behavior data, understanding how people commute, what's the purpose of their travel, that gets input into the model, as well as external travel. And that's really important for Rio Vista, just given its location within the context of the model, but also the transportation challenges that Rio Vista faces with Highway 12 and the traffic on Highway 12. So those are all inputs. All those inputs, including land use, again, that interaction and that need to evaluate the land use transportation interaction, and that statutory requirement, but also a necessary requirement for our analysis for the CEQA and just general transportation planning, is an important input and one that we'll be closely working with the project team on.
Real quick, kind of lower level summary of BMT before we move on, but just a few takeaways I'd like the group to understand. The state, I think it's fair to say, turned us on our ear when they came up with this concept of vehicle miles traveled. We no longer care about if you're stuck at a stoplight. We care how many miles people are driving. Really important at a regional level. To a community member, pretty irrelevant. It doesn't get to what we care about as residents. We are still going to analyze level of service. We're going to look at congestion, getting through intersections. The first thing I want to say. Second thing is Dave's done a great job of, at a very high level, touching on an incredibly complicated subject. So if you didn't quite assimilate everything in that, it's okay. Because what he's talking about is the work we need to do to satisfy environmental review, that California Environmental Quality Act review. And we're in great hands because Farron Pierce has led the industry and they've worked with the state. They've done incredible work helping to sort out this thing that has been very complicated for planners to get their heads around, VMT. So I just want you to understand that, yes, this is really complicated. No, you don't have to fully understand the different data sources that Dave will be relying on, because he's got a great team to do that. And we will also look at the congestion side of things, which is what residents really care about. So Highway 12, again, this gets to a much more detailed
level and much more detailed focused look on Highway 12 and traffic operations. So that's what we're most familiar with, and what Paul was referencing is the delay experienced by drivers, the backups and the problems that those cause for Rio Vista. And again, it's more focused. So this is where we get into that level of service question and the delay question. Again, SB 743 didn't change general plan law. You can still analyze it and discuss it and have policy around what you want for Highway 12 and how you want to tackle that very challenging problem. But we talked about data, so this will be a more focused data, you know, and again, holistic, but we're looking down, we're kind of drilling down on the Highway 12 corridor where we're going to look at intersection operations, where we collect those traffic counts, combine that with the big data options, that data that I was sharing with you, how they travel, how they interact, understanding how the intersections, the signalized intersections operate, the cycle length, the crossing times for pedestrians, how pedestrians interact with Highway 12. What opportunities are there to manage that system and relative to the values of the community, placing the ability of residents to cross Highway 12 versus travel along Highway 12, or for people using Highway 12 that don't live in Rio Vista or interact with Rio Vista. It's understanding what opportunities we have to better manage that system for the benefit of the residents of Rio Vista. I apologize about that. So again, we're gonna collect traffic count data supplemented with the big data opportunities we have, looking at collision data as well. Looking at how Rio Vista residents interact with Highway 12, how the commuter traffic is using the system, and really looking at options ultimately to develop some measures, kind of near term, midterm, and long term, to address the Highway 12 operations. So again, taking that data to inform some policy decisions and get those represented in the general plan through that policy and action items, so that kind of work towards implementing and identifying potentially some long-term solutions, but near-term management to reduce congestion on the corridor. So with that, that's kind of the first major section. Open it up for any questions that you might have before we move on to other related analysis that's being conducted. Good to move.
How are you going to collect a lot of this data? I know you said you've got a lot of new computerized methods of doing it, but some of it almost seems like you have to stop people and ask and talk to them.
Yeah, there is kind of three sets of data. Let's say there's the traffic counts, which traditionally gone out and you collect, you observe conditions, and you count vehicles traveling through the corridor or through an intersection. That's traditional traffic count data. There is survey data where you're soliciting input through a survey, a sampling of the population about how they travel. That data is available, and that's been used for years. But again, the sample is pretty small when you're having to either call someone or get some written response. So that there is some of that data available. What the mobile source data, it just increases that sample size. And so while we're not specifically talking to the individuals, we're able to track their behavior and their travel behavior. We don't know who they are. Let's be very clear, it's anonymous, but we can track them from their origin, where they start their days. Maybe they leave their home in Lodi and they travel through the Highway 12 corridor to get to Fairfield. We can see that trip and we can understand what they're doing and how they're doing it, when they're doing it. And it's a very powerful set of data just because of the sample size. Most everyone has some sort of smartphone. Some of the data is smartphone based, it's app based. Other is also collected through connected cars, connected vehicles. So there's a wide variety of different data sources. Those are kind of two of the best sources for collecting that data. And again, what it's helping us understand is not necessarily the absolute magnitude, the number, but the patterns associated with that. And that's where it's really powerful.
Thank you. I have a comment with regards to Highway 12, and that is, I assume you're also going to be capturing pedestrian traffic crossing over, and to use cell phone data for that as well? I'm curious about the because we only have one actual physical light in town, but I'm curious about traffic crossing across the highway in other locations.
Yeah, that is something that we would collect with that in the context of that focused Highway 12 corridor analysis, where we collect those counts at individual intersections. And those counts would capture cars, light trucks, heavy vehicles, as well as bicycles and pedestrians traveling through the intersection. Right. The one data provider, that streetlight data, it can capture active transportation modes. Depends on not necessarily for the overall magnitude, but the patterns. Again, it becomes down to a sampling question, and especially on Highway 12, where you have congested conditions, where cars are moving or maybe not moving, then it's hard to distinguish between a car and someone walking.
And then as well, we're looking at current transportation modes or current streets. You think about other passages as we grow and develop out, and we have new developments come in. Highway, and I don't know the highway number, but River Road is also a highway, and it seems to me that should be in the study as well.
Okay.
Well, I think that's 84, right?
84.
Okay. Right.
I think you touched a little bit on traffic calming. Is that speed limits? Is that one-way traffic? Is it no through traffic? I mean, what exactly did you mean when you spoke of traffic calming?
Traffic calming can be any number of different measures that either affect kind of two components: speed, reducing speed, so calming traffic, or changing the routes that motorists have to take. So there's a whole host of different measures. Those that have the best from a safety standpoint is just the reduction in speed, and looking at different measures. Those measures could be use of roundabouts for intersection traffic control, which the very function of a roundabout, for example, requires speed reduction. And that's the whole intent, speed reduction, as well as severity of collisions. But there are other measures as well that can be implemented. It could be something like a half street closure, or some kind of vertical deflection or horizontal deflection that gets vehicles or drivers to slow down. There's a menu of different options that could be implemented to calm traffic. Some are physical. And even just the way that technology is changing, there could be kind of some technology available, maybe not right now, but in the near future, where you could have some influence on navigation apps or something along those lines, where you can kind of influence how people travel through a community.
In capturing the data, would you be capturing like Highway 160, which is not in Solano County, and it's not in the city, but we have a fair number of people that use Highway 160 on a regular basis to commute to work, because it's a short hop over to Antioch to catch BART, or they have hospitals and doctor's appointments in Antioch. So there's a lot of people traveling on 160 from Rio Vista.
Yeah, that thanks for bringing that up. I mean, this is the kind of input that we need so that when the next step is to actually collect some data, is to understand what those issues are and make sure that we're capturing the data in a way that'll collect that. So we haven't gone through that specification, but that's helpful. We can certainly make sure that we include and capture that travel behavior.
Just to echo Edwin's part about State Highway 84, then one thing to capture would probably be the disruption of service for the Rio McCoy Ferry and for how many times that piece of machinery fails to be in operation as part of a major state highway, because many locals would have been using it to get to Sacramento, get to Walnut
Mhm.
Grove, rather than having to come back to Highway 12 and go across the bridge. So knowing that Highway 84 and that Rio McCoy operation and the disruption that has
Okay.
certainly increased over the last several years.
Great. Yeah.
The real REAL, real McCoy, kind of ironic, huh? Yeah. This is the second one. This is the real McCoy 2. Yeah. That's this one. This is the real McCoy 2. It's a newer one. The real McCoy 1 is actually on a river, just outside of, I want to say Walnut Grove. Somebody purchased it privately. And it's, yeah.
Okay, any other questions? And we'll move on. So I want to kind of walk through some of the related transportation planning efforts that are ongoing or recently completed that will certainly provide information and input into this project and to our efforts, but also just provides a baseline for understanding what information is available. And one is really current and relevant to the Highway 12 corridor is Caltrans efforts on SR 12 and Rio Vista Complete Streets Update. So that project is looking at 3 segments through Rio Vista and on Highway 12 from roadway rehabilitation to actual striping as you get closer into the city towards the county line, looking at some bicycle pedestrian improvements, as well as roadway rehabilitation. And this information shows just a variety of different improvements in treatments. And I would say that this is something that wouldn't have happened probably 15 years ago in Caltrans. There's some new requirements with all the legislation and their look at more of a complete streets perspective on corridors. So the implementation of these strategies, which has bike lanes on different variations of bike lanes, but class 4 bike lanes, which are a protected bikeway along the corridor, as well as some intersection treatments and crossing treatments is a good next step. And I think one of the questions is that we can address, and it doesn't have to necessarily be here at this meeting today, but just to think about, is this going far enough, or is there more that the community wants to see relative to supporting active transportation on Highway 12 and the character of Highway 12? When you look at these facilities and the number of lanes on the roadway and just the general character, is it create a rewarding, inviting place to walk and bike? Is there more that can be done? And then as part of the Highway 12 analysis, looking at the delays to vehicles or the access for people who walk and bike to cross Highway 12, what opportunities exist, and that's something that we can investigate in that analysis. So providing priority to bicyclists and pedestrians, people who live in the community and want to cross and get to either side, north or south side of Highway 12, what options are there to incentivize those kind of activities?
May I make a comment?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as you're developing this out for our general plan in parallel, of course, Caltrans is about to do the project in the next year or so. it seems to me that most of their stuff is already baked in. So it would be really great if we're in parallel feeding this information over to them, because we continue to say that crossing that they have on that diagram down at Virginia Street is absolutely a mistake because of the traffic coming off of that bridge. Furthermore, there's no safe passage, and I continue to say it. I'm going to continue to say this is a passage to our promenade from under the bridge, which is off this highway as well. There's no safe passage across a highway on the eastern side of our city. And we need to keep banging it in their heads that we need to do that. Oh, comment from the crowd.
Yeah, that crossing underneath the bridge is coming in the HSIP Cycle 11 project. And so there'll be sidewalk with rapid flashing beacons from the one side over across underneath the bridge and then across Front Street to connect to the promenade.
Oh, okay, great. Also on this, you stopped short. You said, do we have comments on the bike lane from Druin to Somerset? Are they doing a bike lane over there on the highway?
On the segment 2.
Somerset.
Yeah,
which
I
is
just didn't
Trilogy.
include that in the presentation.
There is a bike lane,
Yeah, and
just unprotected.
yes.
Yeah.
And the information that that we're discussing here, and the documents that we're bringing up and that I'm referencing will make available to the project team and the committee.
Dave, can you go back to that first slide before this one? You've got a segment in there. It's marked 23. What is that all about? Because it's not part of segment 1 or segment 2. That little curve.
Right.
See where 23 is?
Yeah, I can't. Ooh. We'll look into that. I'll have Ellie and Mary look into that. I can get back to you. Yeah,
Okay.
I'm not sure. The next kind of ongoing transportation project is actually complete, but is the Solano County Active Transportation Plan. So that really pulls together several separate documents into kind of one document that brings in kind of the bicycle plan, pedestrian plan, safe routes to school, safe routes to transit plans, and looks at those holistically. It's a countywide plan, but it also does provide some focus and some recommendations for Rio Vista. And within that, it identifies a Rio Vista bicycle network as well as some pedestrian improvements. This is draft. There are some modifications to this just to reflect current conditions, but I just called it draft, but these are some of the documents and the recommendations that came out of that document. Again, there's some pedestrian improvements, priority pedestrian improvements as well. Again, this is a document that we'll make available. We're referencing it. We'll make it available for further, more in-depth review. But the question here, and in the context of the general plan, do these recommendations go far enough relative to what the community wants to see for active transportation? So it's a starting point, maybe, but maybe there's more that's desired, and we need to make sure that we're reflecting that in the context of the policy document for the circulation element. The other document recently adopted is the Solano County Local Road Safety Plan. And again, the Local Road Safety Plan, or LRSP, it creates a framework for systematically identifying and analyzing safety problems and recommended safety improvements. It's a required document so that the city can go after highway safety improvement program funding. So that's federal funding to address safety problems that are identified through the LRSP. So it's a really important document because it really creates it's a starting point for collecting some of that funds and addressing some safety issues that were identified. And it's updated every 5 years, so it's kind of an ongoing document. So it really we'll collect more recent data, so the most recent data and for the work we're doing relative to safeties and relative to safety accidents and understanding what's causing those. Are there some primary collision factors and some things that we can address or learn about to make sure that we're rolling into the general plan update. But the LRSP did identify 5 key priority areas for the city. And again, those are kind of ranked. They're just locations that identified as priority locations to really go and solicit some recommendations. So within that document, there's recommendations for how to address these issues. One of the 5 is the corridor itself, the Highway 12 corridor itself, which is looking at speed as a primary collision factor on that corridor. So with that, before we go on to key transportation and circulation issues, are there any questions?
This LRSP is done every 5 years. How current is the one that you're talking about?
It was just adopted in 2022, so it's very current.
Okay.
Yeah, but there's a point when they started that. I don't know exactly when it started, but say it started in 2021. There's going to be more current data, so we'll want to collect that more current collision data. So we'll kind of move it forward into the most current 3 or 5 year period and look at that data in this effort. So key transportation and circulation issues. This is not an exhaustive list, but some of the more key issues that are being raised in other communities, and they're going to be relevant to Rio Vista. And it's the concept of accessibility versus mobility. So accessibility is getting to destinations. So the ability to, you're close to destinations. You can walk to those, you can ride a bike to those, or do you have to get in a car to travel, to school or to go shopping and those types of things. And that's really, again, closely related to the land use element. So, as you think about future growth and where the growth occurs and how accessible are destinations to the new growth and the new residential uses, for example. Mobility, just talking about the ease of getting to places. So can't exclude that, but it's just a shift in the way you think about, given some of the challenges on Highway 12, it may not be possible to get to the places you want to go easily. Being closer to goods and services may be desirable. Funding constraints, always an issue. If you expand the transportation system, you're going to have to maintain that transportation system. So it's always a balance, not overstepping, not building a system that you can't afford into the future. And then that creates problems for maintenance and just upkeep of the system itself. So that's a big issue in a lot of communities and statewide for that matter, where the pavement condition in a lot of communities is just at a very poor quality and difficult to maintain even the system that we have today. So it's important to think about that as we consider, additional, potential capacity, or even the types of active transportation facilities that you provide, and being able to maintain those from a class 4 protected bikeway. Just maintaining those can be a challenge for communities because your street sweeper doesn't fit within the lane. It's little things like that, but they can be very important. Technology is changing rapidly. We all see it, we all feel it. And from car share, bike share, ride share, there's opportunities potentially for Rio Vista to take advantage of those services. At the same time, navigation apps can create problems for communities where the navigation apps are trying to find the quickest way, even if it's a minute faster, and they'll route vehicles through communities and neighborhoods that is just not a desirable perspective from the community's perspective. Maybe for the person driving, it has some advantage because it's a little bit quicker, but it creates intrusion impacts to communities. And certainly in Rio Vista, I would expect that that's happening when you have a major bridge issue and it's routing, navigation apps are routing vehicles through community. So how do you message that? And I know that the city has some policy and direction and kind of for different bridge events, and that they reroute and detour vehicles around some of the problem areas or even around the community. But nav apps make that even more difficult. But maybe there's a way in the future. I don't have an answer for you now, but where technology could be worked to help address some of those issues during bridge events. But it's always being open to that and making sure that we're accounting for that in the policy. Intelligent transportation systems, ITS. So this would be the concept of using technology to benefit motorists. Maybe it's the residents in getting across Highway 12 and making those connections more easier, more efficient, or in circumstances when there isn't significant queuing through the city, but looking at where you do have traffic signals either now or in the future, where some are installed, that they're communicating and they're functioning well and working well with to get vehicles, through the community more efficiently. So there's technology that is available, and it's again changing very rapidly with the implementation of 5G networks and the amount of data that can be processed through those creates some opportunities. For example, induced travel is a concept where you're adding new roads and you're inducing people to travel more. You add capacity to a system and people can get to places they couldn't because of congestion, but it's increasing travel. So this in the context of VMT, but in general, just increasing travel when you add capacity to the system is an issue that it's very relevant today. It has a lot of focus on from Caltrans perspective when they're looking at how they manage the transportation system and they add capacity to it. If they add capacity, then it increases vehicle miles of travel, which is contrary to the state's goals for reducing VMT. It's kind of a balance. Safety, again, just talked about the local road safety plan, but it's important relative to those active transportation users, creating an environment that's safe and inviting for use of active modes. It's the difference of walking on a street with low volumes and low speeds versus higher volumes and higher speeds. More likely to choose the lower speed, lower volume option, for example. What technology is available to help improve safety conditions in the city? Evacuation, again, most recently, a lot of the evacuation analysis has been driven by wildfire events, which are certainly seeing a lot of recently, but certainly with Rio Linda and the safety element, there's certainly need to evaluate and look at the evacuation relative to the river and flooding and inundation events. Caltrans coordination. Question, how much coordination do we have in the city? How much do you want? How much influence do you want to have? Or is the city happy with the level of coordination, or how do you want to step that up? Right. So it's a policy question about how we want to interact with Caltrans. It's good. Okay. We're getting there then. So that's exactly what we want to hear. So any questions about those topics or other ones that maybe should be up there that is unique to Rio Vista that we want to talk through and make sure that we're capturing?
Yeah, I don't know. I have noticed in this town that I can move east-west relatively easily, but moving north-south, I'm going through a residential area no matter how I go, it's through a residential area. And when we have recreation activities, say Sandy Beach, say the Army base on one side, say the airport on the other side, you've got to go through a residential area to get to those recreation opportunities. And I don't know there's an answer to that, but that's always been an observation that I would like to try to find some solution to.
Any other questions? Okay. So Highway 12. We talked about kind of the three levels of analysis. They're all going to kind of feed into addressing the Highway 12 operational issues and the impact it has on the city. And really where we want to land and what we're kind of striving for when we put together our work plan is identifying some short and near-term strategies to reduce and manage congestion. Those things that they may be small, but they may be able to balance the desires of the community. Maybe it's more active transportation, more bicycle pedestrian connections, and getting people across Highway 12 as opposed to traveling on Highway 12. But how do you make those connections? What are some opportunities to make that a priority when you get to a traffic signal or an intersection? May not be signalized, but to get people across that corridor safely and as efficiently as possible. So what are some of the near-term options? Near-term, short could be 5 years, near-term could be 15 years, and then looking at long-term solutions, right, to the Highway 12 problems. And those could be, 20 plus years. It's difficult to say exactly what that is. And what are those solutions? The current general plan identifies, at least it acknowledges, location for a potential bridge along kind of the airport road alignment. Some of the balances and trade-offs that were discussed in the document that exists today is what will that do to the community relative to people who stop in Rio Vista, if there's, that kind of bypass concept of people bypassing the community, not stopping, not visiting. So kind of an economic component to it. Those are some things that need to be considered. There's a pricing element, how do you price the system? Do you price the system? One, to either pay for the bridge, and what impact does that have on the local residents? Maybe it gets you a bridge, but it also impacts the residents here. So the solutions, that may not be the only solution, but it certainly is one that, if you want to consider looking at and kind of maintaining and keeping in the document and crafting the policy around that. Maybe the policy that's in the current document's fine. Maybe it needs to be adjusted a bit, but that's kind of up for conversation as well. So Highway 12, again, looking at kind of those short, intermediate, and long-term options for Highway 12 is going to be important in making sure that it's represented in the document appropriately. Any questions?
Can I add something to that next step that
Sure.
you're talking about the bridge? I think we shouldn't just focus in on a bridge. We could have an option for a tunnel too. So hopefully that can be added and talked about at some point.
Okay. Go down and up and or up. Yeah.
I would like to second Walt on that tunnel. It seems to me the tunnel was less, the tunnel idea, it doesn't affect the visual look so much. The highway is just disappearing. Don't build something high in the air that distracts from it. The other problem though, that we have living here is Highway 12 doesn't end here or end at the bridge. Highway 12 goes from Fairfield to Lodi, and it's a 2-lane highway. There are 3 bridges between Fairfield and Lodi. There are 3 bridges between where we sit today and Lodi. And those three bridges are all old and they're all 2-lane. And until we have an answer for all three bridges, we still have a 2-lane highway. And we still have the bottlenecks at each bridge. Yes, you can. Yep. Easier action, easier, because you don't have to build high.
Can I take some public comment on this before we go forward? Anybody from the public want to speak about anything that we just talked about?
My name is Robert Caddy. I don't live in Rio Vista. I live on Highway 12, about 3 miles west. Probably half a mile from the stoplight. And I can tell you, traffic on Highway 12 is unreal. Is you can do all the planning in the world and all the discussions in the world, but somehow Highway 12 has to be, the traffic has to be speeded up to go through the city. You can't, with all the new rules, regulations, Caltrans requirements, I'm gonna slow down the traffic. Traffic's going slow through Rio Vista. In your 10-year plan, and it's a 10-year plan, right? 20? Well, just in the next 10 years, you have to ask yourself, will the traffic increase or decrease? So how much? And what is the decrease on the truck traffic as compared? 75–80% of your efforts has to be put into not bicycle paths and all that stuff, is being able to get the traffic through Rio Vista, because the bridge is a long ways down the road. Years ago, that study was done, and you're right, 3 bridges. Caltrans estimated that cost at that time to be $3 billion to replace those 3 bridges. You got Bolin Island that has to be a causeway. They have to raise it. Say, concentrate on how to get traffic safely through Rio Vista faster.
Anybody else with comments? Anybody online?
I just wanted to make a pitch for the Port of Rio Vista. There are plans underway to restore passenger traffic and tourist traffic from San Francisco to Sacramento, which is historically how people moved from, through California. And I think in the plan and in the transportation, there needs to be some acknowledgement that people arrive here by water or can arrive here by water.
Anybody else?
Yes, well, yeah, I just wanted to mention, because I have heard in some discussions at a level, ferry service is being talked about along the Sacramento River. And we should think about that in our transportation, because the discussions I've heard are ferry service that would include Rio Vista, a stop in Rio Vista and going back to the Bay Area also. So it's very preliminary, but I've heard discussions going on already. So I think we ought to be part of those discussions.
We also have, I'm sorry, Edwin, go ahead.
I was just going to also add that, well, we certainly should have a voice at the regional level to do things on the highway that traverses across the entire county, is focusing on our interior streets as well, and have the 20-year plan or midterm plan. I mean, I think what comes to mind is Irvine, which is off the 405. That highway is a mess, of course. It's very difficult to traverse that. But once you get off of that, they have 6-lane interior roads that feed the local traffic. So you're able to get off the highway immediately and traverse through the city safely. And it's accounted for in the interior streets. So, we could deal with the county, but let's deal with our city as well.
One of the other things coming in February and March, we have a cruise ship, a small one coming up the river twice in February and twice in March. So if that continues, we need to look as maybe possibly capturing that. Maybe Army Base would be a great place to dock a ship of that size. So. Any more public comment? Okay, I'll close public comment.
Okay. So now next steps, so that you know kind of how we're moving forward with our work. We're in the process of reviewing other general plans. So that's other general plans and how they've dealt with, managed situations where they have a state highway running through them. We're going to see there's a list of communities that we have identified. We're pulling the kind of the goals and policies out of those documents to help inform. Maybe there's something that's creative that's been done that is relevant to Rio Vista. So that's in the works. We talked about the data collection effort. So we will take the input that we received and the feedback, and then kind of specify that data collection and move forward with the data collection and identifying those elements that we discussed. Evaluate the planning tools. So we talked about the travel forecasting model, limitations and benefits to using that. And it's likely going to be using that document as well as supplementing it with other survey data or some of the mobile source big data to help with the planning and develop those tools to feed into the analysis. And then with that, the next general plan working group meeting is November 3rd at 5 p.m. So that ends my presentation. Paul, is there anything else?
Chair, that concludes our discussion on circulation. So we can, if there's no further questions, we can wrap that item up.
Okay. Any other questions? Okay. Before we adjourn, I'd like to thank you guys for putting this into the water bills. I think it's very helpful. The only stickler that I see in this is that maybe not all people in Rio Vista use a computer. So we need to reach out to them again somehow. But the information is there if you want to use the computer. One of the things too, going back to our minutes from the last meeting, we talked about Del Rio Hills, and that property's been sold to Flannery. So that might take what we were thinking of doing there kind of out of the equation for the next 30 years or whatever they're planning on doing.
We will be readdressing or picking back up on the land use discussion. But one of the challenges we have is, yes, Flannery owns property, but does that mean that we don't plan for uses on that land? And so we'll have to contemplate how we address that land, and maybe Flannery ownership changes our expectation and how much we think will develop in the 20-year horizon. But I think it's still appropriate for us to be thinking about land use designations for those lands.
So your homework, Paul, is to find out what Flannery's going to do with that property.
Yeah, there's a lot of people working on that assignment.
If there's nothing else, I'll adjourn the meeting.
Chair,
Yep.
just a quick recap of what we have coming up. I'll be sitting in on the October 24th meeting of the Parks Commission, and we're hoping to get input from the commission about any thoughts or direction on the general plan parks elements. So that will be coming up next week. November 1st, I think the commissioners and council members are aware that we have a joint meeting to review the housing element. And if you don't happen to be a member of the city council or planning commission, still very welcome to come to this meeting and learn about the next steps on the housing element. It is the draft housing element is out for review and comment, public review. And then we'll very shortly be turning that into the state for its first consideration. So that's coming up. November 3rd, we will be back as Dave mentioned, we'll be back to pick up on land use. And then that's the next meetings. We do anticipate having a meeting in December. And then we anticipate not holding a general plan working group meeting in January, since the time we would have been preparing for that would have been right over the holidays. So we're going to skip the January meeting and then pick up in February. And we will stick to the first Thursday, 5 o'clock. We won't mess with your schedules anymore. We appreciate your being here this evening, though.
I had a question, Paul. So you said the housing elements out for public review. How is that out to the public? Where would they?
It's posted on the city's website. There's links to it, and it's posted to the general plan website as well, and on the Mind Mixer site. And I think that if you ever registered for Mind Mixer, I think you probably got a tickler that the element
I
is
did
out for
see that.
review.
I just
Yeah.
wondered, people that don't have a computer, how is that? Would it be in the Beacon on Wednesdays, or how would the public know that if they don't have a computer?
There wasn't a published notice in the newspaper. We could quickly arrange for some type of notice in the newspaper.
And there wasn't one for this meeting either. I think there should be one in the paper before we have these types of meetings, so the public is aware of it. I mean,
We can include that. I believe that these are just agendized meetings. They are public hearings. So typically when you see the public hearing notice, it's there
well,
as a
just not
hearing, but
necessarily a public hearing, but just a
there is no reason we
courtesy
can't.
notice that
Yeah,
these are the meetings upcoming. I think a lot of people don't know when we have these meetings, so just a thought.
great thought. And we are really getting into a phase where people coming to the meeting, it's much more important as we're starting to look at these elements and starting to take input. So we're really hoping to see more public participation now. The initial phases as the general plan working group was considering how to do outreach, considering how to conduct community meetings, not as important for community members. So we are interested in every idea to get more members participating.
Can I make a suggestion that the city calendar, which is on the front page of the city website, that the meeting shows up on that calendar so that people can see that? And you could provide a link there to the agenda right on the city calendar. So
Also posted in our bulletins.
And maybe Real Vision could put something in the happenings.
Or even in the Trilogy magazine, comes out once a month, just.
I don't get it.
I know.
Lisa?
I wanted to make the request again, Paul, that for that land use meeting that we have maps, hard copy map. So that as we move through different land use pieces, I can track it versus flipping on a screen and then not being able to see what overlaps. Thanks.
Absolutely. I think we sent out the digitals to
You
you,
did.
right? So
Mhm.
you'd like to have us print some up, print a
Please.
set up. Absolutely. We'll get that through Christine.
If there's nothing else, meeting's adjourned. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.